Howdy. That's Texan for shalom. We start all of our talks at Texas A&M by saying howdy. You can, it's actually quite startling to see the president of the university come to the podium at graduation, say in his academic robe, say howdy, and have 25,000 people yell back howdy. So howdy from Texas. It's my pleasure to be able to speak first because you're still awake. Hopefully I won't put you to sleep and ruin things for my fellow panelists. But what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the approaches that people have taken to analyzing what is still a relatively new administration in Saudi Arabia. King Salman took over in Saudi Arabia at the beginning of 2015 with the death of King Abdullah. So he's only been king for a year and a half. But there's been quite a bit of talk in the media and in analysis of the region about the dramatic changes that King Salman is instituting in Saudi Arabia. There are three areas where lots of observers have talked about how his new administration is said to be pursuing very different policies from his predecessors and in some cases, analysts would say startlingly different policies. The three areas are first, domestic economic management, with the declaration of Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Program, which was just adopted by the kingdom a couple of weeks ago. The objects of this economic change is to make the country less dependent on oil and try to create a larger role for the private sector in the Saudi economy. The second area where observers have said that King Salman has considerably changed the policies of Saudi Arabia is in foreign policy. The Saudis are described these days as being less cautious, more activist, more willing to lead from the front, and more willing to commit their own military forces outside their borders to achieve their foreign policy goals. And the third area where King Salman is said by many observers to be considerably changing the direction of the kingdom is in the transfer of power from his generation of members of the ruling family to the next generation within the Al Saud family. And in making that transfer of power to the next generation, concentrating that power in the hands of just a few members of that next generation. So we have three areas where people are saying that King Salman is quite a departure from his predecessors. I think that the extent and the possibility of change in the first two areas, the domestic economy and foreign policy, is greatly exaggerated by many people who are observing the kingdom. On domestic economy, the prospects for a real transformation in the Saudi economy are limited by a number of factors. First and foremost in my mind is labor market issues. Right? The Saudi economy has actually been, the Saudi private sector, has actually been quite a dynamic creator of employment opportunities in the last 10 years. The problem is that almost all of those jobs have gone to foreigners, very few of them to Saudis. There are a number of reasons for this. We can discuss them in questions, and I'm sure they're going to be taken up tomorrow when you all drive up to Haifa for the second part of our conference. I also think that there will be enormous difficulties for the this Saudi economic plan, Vision 2030, and the National Transformation Program that's supposed to implement it, in attracting foreign and even private domestic investment in Saudi Arabia to areas outside of the energy sector. And finally, the spur to all of this talk about domestic economic change in Saudi Arabia has been, of course, the collapse of oil prices. Right? In 2014, oil prices went from over $100 a barrel, right, toward close to $20 a barrel at their lowest point in 2015. And obviously, for an oil state like Saudi Arabia, right, an 80% decline in the price of oil has enormous fiscal consequences. And the Saudis started thinking seriously about how they were going to live with this. But however, right, we now see oil prices back toward $50 a barrel, and the Energy Information Administration in the United States, in its most recent forecast for the oil market, actually sees the markets tightening up in 2017 and perhaps even a further increase in prices. And to the extent that oil prices go up, the incentives for Saudi Arabia to change economically go down. So I think that it's premature to talk about King Salman as presiding over a significant change in the Saudi domestic economy. That's not to say that there aren't important elements to this national transformation program that are being implemented. The reduction of subsidies on electricity and water, gasoline, the plan to reduce the number of civil service jobs, the number of government jobs. 90% of Saudis who are in the workforce work in one way or another for the government. Right? The reduction of subsidies, and if implemented, a decrease in the number of government jobs, actually presents the possibility of serious political challenges, because Saudi citizens over the decades have come to expect their government to provide them with government jobs, right, and subsidized standards of living. The second element, the turn to activism in foreign policy, I also think is exaggerated. This new activism that people have seen in Saudi foreign policy is, to my mind, basically limited to the area of Yemen. It's only in Yemen that the Saudis have been using their own military forces beyond their borders in a sustained way to try to affect the direction of a civil war. But we have to note that Yemen is the place where the Saudis are least likely to come into a direct confrontation with Iran. The Saudis have been extremely cautious in terms of using their own military forces anywhere else. And even in Yemen, the Saudi intervention has been largely limited to air power. It's the United Arab Emirates and some other partners who have supplied the ground forces for the fighting in Yemen. Other than the Yemen civil war, I see the Saudis using the means that they have always used to try to affect the course of politics in the Middle East. They finance local allies and clients, as they're doing in Syria. They conduct propaganda campaigns through the Arab media, which is largely but not completely Saudi-owned. And they're still exhibiting quite a bit of caution. They're hardly involved in Iraq. And their involvement in Syria is limited enough to avoid a direct confrontation with Iran and Iran's allies in Syria. So I think that it's an exaggeration to say that King Salman is achieving significant change in Saudi Arabia, either on the domestic economic front so far or on the foreign policy front. It's in that third area, right, in the politics of the ruling family itself, where I think we can say that King Salman has had an important, and we will see if it is an enduring legacy for the kingdom. Since the 1960s, Saudi Arabia has basically been ruled by a committee of princes, with the king as the first among equals, right? How dominant the king is vis-a-vis, or the king was vis-a-vis his brothers and half-brothers, right, changed from ruler to ruler. King Faisal, clearly the dominant factor, the dominant player. But after King Faisal, the kings in Saudi Arabia were much more first among equals, if you will, a committee of senior members of the Al Saud family who made the most important decisions. Now that kind of system, basically ruled by committee, has all of the vices that committees have. It's hard to make decisions, hard to come to consensus. Things happen slowly. There's compromises. It's hard to take dramatic decisions. But rule by committee also has the virtue of committees: moderation, caution, prudence. As the brothers and half-brothers who had formed this corporate body of rulers in Saudi Arabia died off, the question many Saudi watchers had was, how are they going to transfer power to the next generation? I assumed, right, that at some point, that generation that had ruled since the 1950s would recreate itself in the generation of its sons, and that what we would see emerge was a group of 6 or 7 or 8 significant princes who would hold important government jobs and who in effect would be the executive committee for ruling Saudi Arabia. But I was wrong. What King Salman has done is to elevate 2 members of that generation, 2 members of the generation of the sons of the princes who had ruled Saudi Arabia from the 1950s, and concentrate power in their hands. Those 2 are Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, who is the crown prince and the minister of the interior, and King Salman's own son, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, young, 31 years old, who is the deputy crown prince, the minister of defense, and the head of the Economic Planning Council, among other positions, and very much the driving force behind policymaking, it seems, in Saudi Arabia right now. Now, what this concentration of power in the hands of 2 members of this generation have done, of course, is to sideline a large number of their cousins, brothers, and half-brothers who thought that they were going to have a share in the decision-making in Saudi Arabia. In fact, King Salman and his son Mohammed bin Salman have largely sidelined members of the family in the rulership of the country. The current cabinet, the current government in Saudi Arabia has fewer members of the Al Saud family in it than at any time in recent history. Only 4 of the portfolios, 4 of the 21 portfolios belong to members of the family, and that includes the king himself, who's prime minister. So the risk in this concentration of power in the hands of just 2 princes is the possibility that that will lead to the mobilization of opposition within the family against them. In other words, all of these princes who have been cut out of power as a result of this concentration might in fact form a bloc within the family to try to overturn this new dispensation of power. There are some indications of disquiet and opposition within members of the Al Saud family to this concentration of power. One unhappy prince actually went to the Western media last fall with reports of letters within the family calling for the return to power of some of those who had been sidelined in this new arrangement. This calls to mind an earlier period of serious intra-family conflict in the Al Saud. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Crown Prince Faisal mobilized a coalition within the family, right, to block King Saud and eventually depose King Saud from power, with Faisal succeeding him as king as a result, in effect, of a family coup against the king in 1964. Despite the signals of unhappiness within the family, there are, as of yet, no public signs that a similar kind of coalition is forming right now against the king and the princes in which he has vested so much power. Now, we don't know much about what goes on within the Al Saud family. Unlike some of the other ruling families in the Gulf, they don't play out their conflicts in public. All we can say is that there are no obvious indications of serious discontent leading to political mobilization within the family against the current king. But it is certainly interesting to note that the precedent of the 1950s and the late 1950s and the early 1960s and the last conflict within the family, right, is something present in the minds of Saudis, of regular Saudi citizens, and also of members of the family. So the bottom line here is that the Saudi regime, So the bottom line here is that the Saudi regime faces important domestic challenges and a dismal regional situation. But it is unlikely, as a result of them, at least in the short term, to face a regime-threatening crisis in the near future, because in my view, in order for the Al Saud to face a regime-threatening crisis, there would have to be, at the beginning, a serious split within the ruling elite, within the family, that would open up the possibilities of dramatic political change. Thank you.